Hi. I wanted to speak for a few minutes about the idea of the Kafkaesque, which of course comes from the name Franz Kafka, who we have just read with the Metamorphosis. Now, the dictionary definition of Kafkaesque is simply something that is characteristic or reminiscent of the oppressive or nightmarish qualities of Franz Kafka's fictional world. So, what does that actually mean? That doesn't really get us very far, does it? Unless you have thoroughly read all of the works of Franz Kafka. So I wanted to take some time to explain what that actually means. First, a few quick biographical notes about Kafka, some context, if you will. Kafka was born in Prague, in what was then the capital of the Kingdom of Bohemia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1883. He was born into a German-speaking Jewish family, and he would have a sort of fluctuating relationship with Judaism throughout his life, throughout his rather brief life. His father was the kind of manly man, an ill-tempered domestic tyrant. He was the owner of a dry goods company, and he really excelled in business. And he was always kind of mean to his son Franz, and Franz would develop a sense of guilt and shame, and a kind of inferiority complex in light of his father's critical eye, and in light of his inability to be what his father thought a man should be. Kafka would never really live up to his father's image of what he ought to be doing with his life, and his father seems to have always kind of been really harsh on him and really looked down on Kafka's literary pursuits. So Franz would go to law school, but he wouldn't become a lawyer. He instead got a job at the Workmen's Accident Insurance Administration of the Kingdom of Bohemia, and he would work there from 1908 until 1922. So not very long career, because in 1917 he begins to suffer from tuberculosis, and it would gradually worsen. He would eventually all but stop eating, and then he would die in 1924. And when he died, he wasn't really a well-known literary figure. The Metamorphosis had been published along with a couple of collections of short stories, but his most major works, his novels, The Trial, America, and The Castle, would all be unpublished at the time of his death and essentially incomplete. Franz Kafka, in fact, he was kind of ashamed of his work. He wasn't confident in his stories and putting them out there in the world, and he instructed his friend Max Brod to burn all of his writings upon his death. But Brod, thankfully, did not do what his friend wished, and instead set about publishing all of Kafka's works into the world, which are not a lot. It's really a handful of stories, a good amount of letters, and then those three novels, which are still, they're unfinished, which kind of serves those novels well in a way that they're unfinished, actually, because a lot of the theme and the idea of Kafka's work in general is the idea that there is no real solution to some of these problems that the characters face. So, what characterizes, or what is reminiscent of these works of Kafka's? There's a lot of different ways that the Kafkaesque can be defined. There's a lot of different ways of reading Kafka, but one of the through lines, they usually involve a societal structure that acts upon its citizens and constructs them, and seemingly having outgrown the control of the people by whom it was constructed. So the characters in Kafka's stories, they're not acting so much as they are acted upon. They're sort of cogs in this machine. So there's a kind of mechanized quality to Kafka's societies. They generally involve rigid, complex bureaucracies that obscure the human elements of their design. They alienate the human touch. their creator. So a bureaucracy is a system of administration characterized by specialization of functions and adherence to fixed rules and a hierarchy of authority. So there's a lot of middlemen, there's a lot of red tape in a bureaucracy. And in the works of Kafka, we often see this as a kind of a labyrinth, a kind of maze. There's paperwork, there's various officials and secretaries, local government employees, local government officials. There's all these different layers of authority. Everybody has to answer to somebody else, and nobody's really sure where the whole thing, where the center of it all is, where it all comes to an end, who is actually in control of everything. And it reaches a point where the system is sort of in control of itself, as a kind of self-perpetuating system that really runs on its own, so much so that the people in it no longer have any control. Even if they might have created the system, they are sort of now at the whims of this mechanical structure that they've created. So we see the characters in Kafka coming face to face with this and really struggling in the face of this senseless absurdity, and discovering a kind of within this labyrinth, within this maze of bureaucracy, we find this kind of a disorder within a presentation of hyperorder. Everything presents itself as being like a well-oiled machine, but actually it's just absolute chaos because nobody really knows what the purpose of all of this bureaucracy, what the purpose of all this red tape, all this paperwork is. And we can find that rooted in Kafka's. Well, one of the places we can find it rooted in is in Kafka's own real life job, which he considered kind of mundane, working in an insurance company. It wasn't really something that stimulated his imagination. But we can also find it rooted in the dictates of his father. And then in the Metamorphosis, of course, we can kind of see this in Kafka's biggest concern when he wakes up and finds himself turned into a giant bug, a giant vermin. The main thing he's concerned with is getting to work, getting out of bed. He's looking at the clock, right? The clock is sort of the controlling factor of his psyche. He's obsessed with the clock. He's obsessed with getting to work on time, with catching the train. And of course, his boss comes around looking for him right away. He's so locked into this mechanical structure of his society that he's not able to process the fact that he's been transformed into a monster in any real way. His consciousness is so ruled by his authoritative society of work and the clock and the trains and all this, that this amazing, weird, magical, terrifying thing that's happened to him pales in comparison. So much so that he doesn't even really pay much heed. It's something that is simply there just to be overcome. He's just there. The fact that he's a bug is just an obstacle in the way of him getting back into his routine of of work and going to his job and catching the train. So we have this character coming, struggling against this senseless absurdity, coming face to face with a kind of authoritarian system, a system that is self-perpetuating, it controls itself, it's mechanized, it turns people into, just elements of the machine, basically. And for the most part, the people participating in these societies, their humanity is lost. In the works of Kafka, we often find stories in which the characters are sort of falling out of that system, and there's terror and panic at falling out of that system. There's an alienation, and they're removed from the system, and things such as being turned into a giant bug. When Gregor Samsa is turned into a giant bug, he is removed from the mechanics of his society, right? And he sort of sees it for what it is. And he starts to see himself for what he is in a weird way. By, in some ways, looking at that void that is left when he's taken out. So he's at once alienated and hopeless in the condition that he now finds himself in, Gregor Samsa, when he's turned into a giant bug. He's isolated, he's removed from society, he's alienated, he's kind of all alone. There's also kind of liberation in this because it's a way for a character like Gregor to sort of come to terms with his own senseless existence, right? It's a way for him to make peace with the absurdity of life. And in the case of Gregor, he kind of stops struggling against the system or even to get back into the system, right? He makes a peace with his alienation, with his isolation, and he makes peace with the fact that he can forsake the system and escape from it, even if that escape means that he has to turn into a monster and lose his family and everything else in order to do so. Nonetheless, he is liberated. In a way, he ends up becoming more human, less of a mechanical cog than he was in the beginning through this metamorphosis. So those are kind of some of the key elements of the Kafkaesque. The Kafkaesque is something you might hear thrown around a lot. Maybe somebody's waiting in a long line at the bank or something, and they might say that's Kafkaesque, but that's not really Kafkaesque. The Kafkaesque really has to do with these hyperactive social structures that have outgrown the human touch and alienate people, isolate people within those structures, such that any logic behind this this system that presents itself as extremely logical is so authoritative in its logic that all logic, any central logic, evaporates and becomes lost and is not really attainable again, except for through an escape from the system altogether, or through a complete deterioration of that social structure. So that's a bit about the Kafkaesque. Again, that's one reading of it. There's a lot of different ways to define the Kafkaesque and a lot of different ways to read the works of Kafka, and all of his works offer themselves up to a multitude of different interpretations. So that's just one, but hopefully something to think about, and hopefully you have enjoyed the metamorphosis.